I want to pose the question, if I can, Madam Speaker, to this House. What's the length of New Zealand's coastline? Like I'd imagine the other side of the House doesn't have the answer. It's 15,000 kilometres in length. Let's conceptualise 15,000 kilometres by 200 nautical miles. It's several million square kilometres of coastline at our disposal. To contextualise, without the catastrophisation of marine farming in New Zealand, Rachel Brooking, without the catastrophisation, what that looks like in terms of affording the rural sector, the farming sector, some of our most marginal communities, the kind of economic activity that we would, on this side of the House, celebrate. Now, I'm trying to see where the issues lie. I've heard the member, Steve Abel, raise concerns about the benthic environment, and I think perhaps those remarks are salient to the sentience of finfish farming. I want to go back to the 15,000 kilometres of coastline in New Zealand. That is 1/3 the length of the entire coastline around Australia. We've only 5 million people here in New Zealand. Let's frame some logic in the debate without the priestly sermons, Madam Speaker. I want to see economic activity afforded to all New Zealanders, sir, and I respect your opinion, but I handsomely disagree with you. Some of the poorest New Zealanders are in our regions. Some of the poorest New Zealanders, sir, in New Zealand happen to be people that live in coastal communities, and by certainty that this bill would bring them, I would hope that we could see some of the support for this legislation on the left. We've heard about the sentience of finfish farming. We also heard the counterfactual, that the population densities in those finfish farming environments was conducive, that the concerns that the member raised and I raised and others raised in the Select Committee weren't as onerous as perhaps was otherwise as framed. We heard about the frequency of development that this piece of legislation would afford, Madam Speaker, with mussel spat, and how wonderful that industry was with the 3,500 people that this entire industry encapsulated. 3,500 jobs. And I wager anyone worth their salt, when we're trying to frame that in our minds, what that looks like when we're talking about $700 million for 3,500 people. Wow. In a country that is economically depressed, with the left respectfully telling us every day, ad nauseum, they care about people. Well, I absolutely do. I absolutely do. I live and I go home in rural New Zealand, and they are economically deprived, quite often suffering. The average income in New Zealand in some of those areas is $37,000. I wager anyone that this kind of business would certainly afford them the reality that they absolutely deserve. I'm sorry that I disagree with Tangi Utakere. Good member, sat on my committee, very collegial. But this is a debate chamber where we actually put cause and effect, causality you might say, into the debate, sir, and I don't think that member has actually reconciled causality, cause and effect. This will give investment certainty to the kind of people that deserve it. Everyone in this chamber here, we have a pretty comfortable lifestyle, you might say, by virtue of our income. These people often do not. And when I'm trying to reconcile $20,000 to $100,000 for a resource consent, some said flippantly, that's not a lot of money. Well, it certainly is when your margins are slight. Operational costs in the remarks by Steve Abel were excluded in that part of his debate. I appreciate his remarks. Over 20 years, you would argue, Madam Speaker, that isn't a lot of money if you extrapolate that out over 20 years, which this is the extension we're affording. But that assumes that these businesses, kind sir, do not have costs, and they're exorbitant, excluding the resource consent. The margins are so slight, and I'm not going to over-litigate the point because I want to hear what remarks other members have in their speech that supports rural New Zealand. We hear all the time on the other side of the House, the evangelical sermons, I care about rural New Zealand, I care about poor people, I care about marginal communities. Well, this bill, being shepherded by my Primary Production Select Committee with the steer of Minister Jones, I think puts fishing people, fishing communities, rural people, Rachel Booking, back into the conversation. That is our job as parliamentarians, to represent their interests, and hopefully tomorrow's a little bit better for those people than today. I commend this bill to the House.